The afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the quiet suburban neighborhood. The rhythmic chirping of birds and the occasional hum of a passing car filled the air. From the kitchen window, Claire watched the world outside, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She had always considered her life predictable, structured, stable, and comfortably uneventful. But that was before the new neighbor moved in. It had been 3 weeks since he arrived, carrying boxes into the modest house next door. Claire had watched from a distance, intrigued yet unsure why. He was a tall, well-built black man, likely in his late 30s, with an air of quiet confidence. He wasn't overly social, but he exchanged polite nods whenever their paths crossed. There was something about him, something Claire couldn't quite define. A familiarity that tugged at the edges of her mind. Her husband, Daniel, barely noticed. He was the type of man who focused on work, responsibilities, and maintaining order in their lives. Conversations between them had dwindled to logistical discussions, groceries, bills, schedules. There was no malice, only routine. If he sensed Claire's restlessness, he never acknowledged it. One evening, as Claire stepped onto the porch, she saw the neighbor working on his car. The hood was propped open, his hands moving deftly over the engine. A streak of grease lined his forearm. He must have sensed her presence because he glanced up, offering a small, knowing smile. "Evening," he said, his voice deep and steady. Claire hesitated before responding. "Evening. Car trouble?" "Not really. Just maintenance." He wiped his hands on a rag, then looked at her more intently. "You live next door, right?" She nodded. "Claire. And you?" "Malcolm." He paused as if weighing his words. "Nice to finally meet you." "Finally." The word lingered, unsettling yet oddly comforting. Claire smiled politely, though inside, something stirred, an inexplicable feeling that she had known him before. As the days passed, she found herself noticing him more. The way he jogged early in the morning, the way he carried himself with quiet assurance. She told herself it was nothing, just curiosity about a new neighbor. But at night, when the house was silent and Daniel was asleep beside her, she would stare at the ceiling, unable to shake the sense that Malcolm wasn't a stranger at all. Then, one afternoon, while clearing out the attic, she found it. A faded photograph buried in an old box. Her breath caught as she lifted it into the light. It was a picture of her as a child, no older than 10, standing beside a young black boy. They were both smiling, arms casually draped over each other's shoulders. Claire's pulse quickened. The boy in the photo had the same eyes as the man next door. And suddenly, she understood why Malcolm felt so familiar. Claire's hands trembled as she held the photograph. The boy standing beside her, Malcolm. It had to be him. The shape of his face, the eyes, even the way he stood. But how? How had she forgotten someone who had once been so close to her? The attic felt stifling, the dust-choked air thick with memory. She sat down on an old wooden trunk, her mind racing. She had been 10 when the photo was taken. A summer spent in a small town where her parents had volunteered at a community center. That's where she had met him. Malcolm had been her best friend, her shadow, the one person who had made those months unforgettable. But then, as quickly as that summer had come, it had ended. They had moved back home, and time had done what it always did, erased, blurred, reshaped. Claire stared at the photograph as if willing it to speak, to fill in the blanks. Had Malcolm remembered her all this time? Did he move here by coincidence, or had he known? That evening, she found herself watching for him again. He was in his yard, watering a row of hydrangeas. She wondered if he planted them himself or if they had been left by the previous owner. The air between them felt charged, as if unspoken words lingered just beneath the surface. Taking a breath, she stepped off her porch and crossed the narrow strip of lawn that separated them. He turned as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Hey," she said, forcing a casual tone. "Hey," Malcolm responded, setting the hose aside. His gaze was steady, but there was something else there, something she couldn't quite place. Claire hesitated, the photograph burning in her pocket. She wanted to pull it out, to demand answers, but instead, she blurted, "You ever get the feeling you've met someone before?" Malcolm's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Yeah. Sometimes. Silence stretched between them. Claire felt like she was standing on the edge of something, a truth just out of reach. You grew up around here? She asked, probing gently. Malcolm shook his head. No. Moved around a lot as a kid. Foster homes. Her chest tightened. Foster homes. She remembered now Malcolm had been in the system back then too. A boy with no permanent home, no real family. She had promised to be his friend forever, but in the end, she had left, just like everyone else. You okay? Malcolm asked, studying her face. Claire forced a smile. Yeah. Just remembering something. His eyes held hers for a moment longer before he nodded. Memories can be funny like that. As she walked back to her house, Claire knew she couldn't leave it at this. She needed to know the truth. Tomorrow, she would show him the photograph. Claire barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, fragments of childhood memories surfaced, laughter echoing through sunlit fields, whispered secrets under the shade of an old oak tree, the quiet sadness in Malcolm's eyes when she had left. She had forgotten him, but had he ever forgotten her? By morning, she knew what she had to do. With the photograph tucked in her hand, she walked next door. Her pulse quickened as she knocked. Malcolm answered almost immediately, his expression neutral but expectant. Morning, he said. Claire hesitated only a second before holding out the faded picture. I think we've met before. Malcolm took the photo slowly, his gaze dropping to the image. For a moment, he didn't react. Then his fingers tightened around the edges, his jaw tensing. I found it in my attic, Claire continued, her voice softer now. I didn't remember at first, but when I saw it, You left, Malcolm interrupted. His voice wasn't harsh, but there was a weight to it. He exhaled, shaking his head as if in disbelief. After all these years. Claire's stomach twisted. I didn't mean to. I was just a kid. My family moved, and you forgot. His eyes lifted to hers, filled with something unreadable. I didn't. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. I wrote you a letter, Malcolm said finally. Back then. I had this idea that if I could find the right words, maybe you'd write back. Maybe you wouldn't forget. He let out a hollow chuckle. Guess I never sent it. Foster homes don't make it easy to hold on to things. Claire's throat tightened. Malcolm, He shook his head, his expression softening. It's not your fault. Life happens. He studied the photograph again, tracing the worn edges. I used to look for you sometimes. In crowds, on social media. But I never thought I'd actually find you. And now, here we are. Claire swallowed hard. Here we are. For the first time, Malcolm smiled, small, hesitant, but real. Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Can I make it up to you? He raised an eyebrow. How? She gestured toward the porch. Coffee. A real conversation? Malcolm hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. I'd like that. As they walked inside, Claire felt something shift, like a long-buried part of her was finally coming to light. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as Claire and Malcolm sat across from each other on her porch. The morning sun cast soft shadows across the wooden deck, and for the first time in days, Claire felt like she could breathe. They spoke cautiously at first, reminiscing about their childhood, filling in the blanks where memory had faded. Malcolm recalled how they would race down dirt paths until their legs gave out, how she had once declared they would be best friends forever. Claire laughed at the memory, though it carried an ache of guilt. I really did mean it, she said, stirring her coffee absently. At least, back then. Malcolm leaned back, exhaling slowly. I know. It just took me a long time to accept that some people aren't meant to stay. Claire's stomach twisted. That's not true. We were just kids. I didn't have a choice. I get that now, he admitted. But back then, every time I had to pack my bags and leave another home behind, I convinced myself you'd forgotten because I wasn't worth remembering. She set her cup down, the weight of his words settling deep. I did forget. But not because you weren't important to me. I think. I buried a lot of things from that time. Maybe because it hurt too much to remember. Malcolm studied her, as if measuring the sincerity in her words. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. I guess we both lost something back then. A comfortable silence settled between them. The past couldn't be undone, but maybe, just maybe, they could build something new. Claire's husband, Daniel, stepped onto the porch then, his brow furrowed as he took in the scene. Morning, he said, his tone neutral but questioning. Morning, Malcolm replied, his expression unreadable. Claire cleared her throat. Daniel, this is Malcolm. We knew each other as kids. Daniel's eyes flickered between them before he gave a curt nod. Didn't realize you two had history. Claire forced a smile. Neither did I. Until recently. Daniel held her gaze for a moment, then shrugged. Well, nice to meet you. Without waiting for a response, he disappeared back inside. Malcolm chuckled under his breath. He doesn't seem thrilled about me being here. Claire sighed. Daniel doesn't dwell on the past. Everything is about what's next, what's efficient. She glanced at Malcolm. But I'm not like that. At least, not anymore. Malcolm smiled, a real one this time. Good. Because I don't plan on disappearing again. Relief flooded through Claire. Neither do I. As Malcolm stood to leave, he hesitated before turning back. Claire. I'm glad we found each other again. She smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. Me too. As he walked away, she watched him, feeling lighter than she had in years. Some connections, she realized, were never truly lost, they just waited for the right time to be found again.